Hello everyone, welcome to this new session in your module Agile and Hybrid Project Management. Today we are going to cover cost planning basics. Well, first of all, I would like to introduce the topic a little bit and to explain that cost estimation is a natural first step in determining whether a project is viable or not. So the main objective of cost estimation is to create a reasonable budget baseline for the project and identify which project resources will be needed, both human resources and material resources. So in this way, you need to understand that cost estimation and project budgeting go hand in hand in a project. Well, here you have the main objectives for this session. The first one is that you understand the different types of project cost that you usually find in a project. And the second one is that you understand the differences between various forms of project cost. Well, the main types of project cost that you can find in projects could be grouped in these five main areas. The labor costs that are the costs associated with hiring and paying the various personnel involved in developing the project. It means the different types of worker, skilled, semi-skilled, or laborers that we will need over time in the project. The second group is materials. This concept applies to the specific equipment and supplies that the project and the project team will require to complete the different project tasks. For construction projects, the material costs are quite large, but for many other projects from other industries, the materials cost may be relatively small. For example, for a software project or for many projects in the service industries. These kind of projects involve little or no material cost at all. The third type corresponds to subcontractors. These are the costs connected with the externalization or outsourcing of different tasks, or, for example, in the case of consultants, when we pay for expertise. So, some example for this kind of cost could be to hire a marketing communication professional to design the project's promotional material, or the cost for an industrial designer to create an attractive product packaging. The fourth type of cost is the equipment and facilities. In some cases, the projects are developed away from the firm's home office, and this will require members of the project team to work off-site. In that case, companies usually include a rental of equipment or office facilities as a charge against the cost of the project. And the last one is travel. Sometimes we need to include expenses that are related to business travel, like car rentals, hotels, meals, etc. Another important aspect to take into consideration when estimate cost is the nature of the cost. Depending on the nature of the cost, we can distinguish between direct and indirect cost. The direct costs are those clearly assigned to aspects of the project that generate the cost. It means labor and materials. For example, all labor costs associated with the workers who built a house are considered direct costs. However, sometimes some labor costs could be not considered as direct costs for the project. Usually they are costs associated with support personnel, such as the project's cost accountant or other project management resources that are not allocated directly to a specific project. On the other hand, the indirect costs are connected with two main features: overhead and selling and general administration. Sometimes we refer to these costs as G&A expenses for general and administrative overhead. Overhead costs include all sources of indirect material, utilities, taxes, insurance, property and repairs, depreciation on equipment, health and retirement benefits for the labor force, etc. In terms of the frequency of the cost, we can distinguish between recurring and non-recurring costs. Non-recurring costs are usually associated with charges that applied once at the beginning or end of the project, such as preliminary marketing analysis, personal training, etc. While recurring costs are those that typically continue to operate over the project's life cycle. Here we can include labor, material, logistics. An alternative designation for applying project costs is to identify fixed and variable costs in the project budget. Fixed costs don't vary with respect to their usage, while variable costs are those that accelerate or increase through usage. And finally, we can distinguish between normal and expedited cost. Normal costs refer to those incurred in the routine process of working to complete the project, according to the plan schedule agreed by all project stakeholders at the beginning of the project. While expedited costs are unplanned costs that happen when steps are taken to speed up the project's completion. For example, suppose that a project is falling behind a schedule and we decide to take some actions to regaining some lost time. The cost of these actions would be considered as expedited cost. Well, maybe the most typical differentiation of cost, depending on its nature, is to classify them as direct costs or indirect costs. We usually consider the materials, the labor, the equipments as direct costs, while the indirect costs are the project overhead. These include all the indirect materials, utilities, taxes, insurance, property and repairs, the depreciation on equipment that we are using, all the benefits connected with human resources such as health insurance, retirement, the general and administrative overhead, which include the advertising, the salaries for secretarial support, sales and commission, and all these similar costs. Here you can see graphically how we can explain the project price at different levels. First, we will distinguish between the cost and obviously the profit that the company must earn. For the cost, we can differentiate between a direct cost that will include the material, labor, and equipment, and the indirect or overhead costs, which are the general and administrative overhead and the project overhead. And then we should add some costs for contingency plans. Here you can see through a simple example how to develop a fully loaded labor cost. Let's consider that we need a geotechnical engineer in our project and her or his annual salary is of £75,000, which means that the hourly rate is approximately 37.50 per hour. It's expected that the involvement of the engineer in that project is going to be 80 hours. So we can consider the hourly rate by the hours needed. This would be the labor cost. However, we need to consider the overhead charge. It means what the company pays in terms of health benefits and retirement and other charges against the project connected with the participation of this engineer. So this represents in that case an increment of 65%. So this would be the fully loaded labor cost. But even if we want to do a more realistic allocation, we should consider this factor, the personal time, as we can assume as we can assume that no one truly works a full 8 hours day as part of the job. This is basically an allowance for a reasonable degree of personal time during the workday. This is simply a recognition of the need to make personal calls, have a coffee break, etc. Well, there is some relation between fixed and variable costs for linear and iterative lifecycle approaches. Usually for projects that follows a linear life cycle, the scope and the quality are fixed, while the costs could vary. Particularly, we will have some fixed cost, but also we will have these variable costs that will grow throughout the project because they are connected with the proper working of the project. However, in projects that follow iterative life cycle, usually the schedule and the costs are fixed, so the presence of variable costs is less frequent. As we said, the fixed or non-recurring costs happen once in a project life cycle and contribute a single cost. For example, at the beginning of the project, when we have to do some research and development, or when we have to do some machine setup or site activation, etc. On the other hand, the variable or recurring cost will happen periodically, and they contribute to multiply the cost with a cumulative effect, as you can see here. These type of costs are, for example, the maintenance, production line costs, or costs related with administrative issues. Also, in an iterative project lifecycle, the release of funds may be more frequent because we are having closer interactions with the sponsor as work is completed in short periods of time. However, in linear life cycle, the funds are usually released at decision gates or when we achieve a milestones or sometimes monthly depending on the work that has been executed. Other important concept that you need to be aware of is the contingency plans. We can create contingency plans in terms of cost and time. As you know, by definition, a project is unique and you will have to deal with a lot of uncertainty. That's the reason because the presence of contingency plans are good in projects. Here we are going to talk very briefly about cost estimation methods. Companies use several methods to estimate project cost, ranging from highly technical and quantitative to the more qualitative approaches. Among the more common cost estimation methods, we can distinguish the following. Ballpark estimates, sometimes referred to as order of magnitude estimates. Ballpark estimates are typically used when either information or time is scarce. Companies usually employ this estimate method as preliminary estimate for resources requirements or to determine if a competitive bid can be attempted for a project contract. The second method is comparative estimates. In that case, we can use historical data as a frame of reference for current estimates on similar projects. A third method is feasibility estimate. These estimates are based on real numbers derived after the completion of the preliminary project design work. So, following the initial development of the scope, it's possible to request quotes from suppliers and other subcontractors with more confidence, so we can provide and determine a working project baseline. Usually, these feasibility estimates could have a degree of accuracy of 10%. And finally, we have the definitive estimates, which are given only upon the completion of most design work, at a point when scope and capabilities of the project are quite well understood. So the definitive estimates can be expected to have an accuracy of 5%. Sometimes, while cost estimation can involve significant calculation and some amount of guesswork for certain types of project, in other cases, project managers and cost estimators can calculate project costs with much greater degree of accuracy. This basically depends on the nature of the project and to what extent we can assimilate our project to previous project. For many construction projects, particularly in standard residential and commercial building, we can employ estimates based on relatively stable historical data that makes it much easier to determine cost with good accuracy. So there are different cost databases and internet sites that include building cost calculators that can predict very well some construction costs. The key to cost estimation lies in a realistic appraisal of the type of project that we are going to undertake and the comfort level of top management regarding cost estimation error. If the information is available, it is reasonable to expect the project cost estimation as soon as possible. So we can create a sample project cost estimation form as an initial working document for budgeting. The process of developing a project budget is an interesting mix of estimation, analysis, intuition, and repetitive work. The project budget is a plan that identifies the allocated resources, the project's goal, and the schedule that allows an organization to achieve the project's goal. Here you can see that the three main pillars in project plan is to develop the work breakdown structure, the scheduling, and the budgeting, and they will be interrelated. So obviously we can use the information from our work breakdown structure and some information from the scheduling to develop our budget. The ways in which cost data are collected and integrated to create the budget will depend on the company. Some firms prefer to follow a top-down approach, others a bottom-up budgeting procedure. But maybe a very good practice, at least for construction project, is to use the activity-based costing, which is basically to allocate the cost for the different activities, for the different tasks that we have already identified through the scoping process, through the development of a well-detailed work breakdown structure. So here you have the summary for this session. Basically, it's important that you understand the different types of project cost that you can find in a project and to recognize the differences between various forms of project cost. Particularly important the differences between direct and indirect costs, and to understand that we will have some fixed cost versus variable cost. So that's all from me now. Here you have the bibliography. Please have a look at the reader list as I have recommended you some chapters from different books in order that you can explore more and to extend your knowledge about cost planning. I'll see you soon in our synchronous session. Goodbye.